Thanks for sticking around, fam. If you're just joining the Eva family, you're in the right place. Before we begin, I want to say thank you for giving Eva something you can never take back, your time, which is your life. And I promise, every story I tell will be worth it. So, if you're ready, sit back, relax, and let's begin our story. Inside the opulent ballroom of the Robertson estate, beneath crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across marble floors, a small figure sat motionless. 6-year-old Brian Robertson, dressed in a miniature tuxedo that seemed to swallow his tiny frame, stared at nothing. His small hands clutched a photograph. His mother, Amanda, laughing on the deck of their yacht, hours before the ocean claimed her forever. "Brian, sweetheart, would you like some cake?" A server bent down, offering a porcelain plate with a slice of elaborate dessert. No response, not even a blink. Just that same hollow stare that had become his only expression for the past 18 months. The server straightened, exchanging worried glances with her colleague. Around them, the charity gala swirled with movement, elegant guests in designer gowns and tailored suits, champagne glasses clinking, laughter echoing off vaulted ceilings. But the boy remained frozen, an island of stillness in a sea of celebration. Across the room, his father stood, George Roberson, tech billionaire, self-made mogul, a man who'd built an empire with nothing but determination and brilliance, now completely powerless. His hands gripped a whiskey glass so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He'd tried everything, every specialist, every therapy, every treatment money could buy. Nothing worked. His son was alive, but not living, breathing, but not present. "George, you're going to shatter that glass," a woman's voice, smooth as silk, cut through his thoughts. He turned to find Monica Prescott, his business partner, impeccably dressed in emerald green, her smile practiced and perfect. She placed a manicured hand on his arm. "You need to relax. Remember, this event is for the cameras. Show them the strong George Robertson who's overcome tragedy." George wanted to laugh. Overcome? He hadn't overcome anything. He was drowning, and no one could see it. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Monica's grip tightened slightly. "You can and you will. For Brian, for the company, for what?" George snapped, louder than intended. Several nearby guests turned. He lowered his voice. "My son hasn't smiled in 547 days, not once." Something flickered across Monica's face. Was it sympathy or calculation? With her, it was always hard to tell. "Then maybe," she said slowly, "it's time to try something drastic." Before George could respond, the event coordinator appeared, gesturing toward the stage. Time for the speech. Time to perform grief recovery for the cameras. Time to pretend he had answers when he had none. George drank his whiskey and handed the glass to a passing server. As he walked toward the podium, he glanced back at Brian. His son sat exactly as before, surrounded by expensive decorations and untouched gifts. Utterly alone, despite the crowd. Something inside George cracked. When he reached the podium and the music lowered, hundreds of faces turned toward him expectantly. Cameras raised, phones appeared. He gripped the microphone, his prepared speech dissolving in his mind. "Thank you all for coming tonight. We're here to support children's mental health initiatives, to help families facing..." His voice caught. He looked at Brian again. "To help families like mine." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the script. "My son hasn't smiled in 18 months, George continued, the words pouring out now, unstoppable. "I've spent millions on doctors, specialists, therapists. Nothing works. Nothing reaches him." The ballroom had gone completely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving. George's hands gripped the podium. "So tonight, I'm making a promise. A desperate one. Maybe a foolish one." He paused, his eyes sweeping the stunned faces. "Whoever makes my son smile, truly smile, will be my wife." Gasps, shocked laughter, whispers exploding into noise. George didn't care. He stepped away from the microphone and walked straight to Brian, kneeling beside his son's chair. "Someone out there can help you, buddy," he whispered, though Brian gave no sign of hearing. "Someone has to." Near the back of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a serving station, a woman in a staff uniform froze mid-pour. Champagne overflowed the glass she had been filling, splashing onto the silver tray. Reatha Johnson had been trying to remain invisible, just another worker in a room full of people who never noticed the help. But she'd heard everything. And when she looked at that small boy, really looked at him, something in her chest tightened. She knew that emptiness. She'd seen it in her own daughter's eyes after her father abandoned them. She'd felt it herself on the darkest nights, when rent was due and there was no money, when Jasmine needed medication they couldn't afford, when the world seemed designed to crush people like her. She set down the champagne bottle with trembling hands. Her supervisor hissed, "Reatha, what are you doing? Get back to work." But Reatha wasn't listening anymore. Her feet were moving, carrying her through the crowd of glittering gowns and expensive suits. People stepped aside, confused by the staff member walking with such purpose. A few frowned, as if her presence in their space was an intrusion. She didn't stop until she reached Brian's table. The boy didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her at all. Reatha knelt slowly, bringing herself to his eye level. She didn't speak at first, just waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Around them, chaos had erupted. Wealthy women were already descending on George, volunteering themselves, seeing opportunity. Monica stood frozen near the stage, her perfect composure finally cracked. But Reatha saw none of it. She only saw the child. Carefully, she reached for a napkin on the table and began folding it. Her grandmother had taught her this trick years ago, how to make simple originals from whatever was available. It had comforted Jasmine through countless difficult nights. "You know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have a little girl at home who feels sad sometimes too." Brian's eyes flickered. Just slightly, but it was the first sign of awareness anyone had seen in months. Reatha continued folding, her hands steady despite her racing pulse. "Her name is Jasmine, and when she's really sad, we make up stories. Would you like to hear one?" For the first time in 547 days, Brian Robertson turned his head and looked directly at another human being. And in that moment, everything changed. For the first time in 547 days, Brian Roberson turned his head and looked directly at another human being. And in that moment, everything changed. But this moment, this impossible, miraculous moment, didn't begin tonight in the glittering ballroom. It began 18 months ago, on a yacht deck where laughter turned to screams, and a little boy's world shattered into pieces no amount of money could put back together. 6 weeks earlier, Brian woke the same way he had every morning since that day, to silence. No birds singing outside his window registered. No sunlight streaming through expensive curtains brought comfort. He simply opened his eyes because his body demanded it, stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, a room filled with every toy a child could want, and felt nothing. Brian, sweetheart, Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, knocked softly before entering. She carried a breakfast tray, fresh pancakes shaped like stars, strawberries arranged in a smiley face, orange juice in his favorite cup with the hero logo. "Look what Chef Marcus made for you." Brian sat up mechanically, looked at the tray, said nothing. "Just a few bites?" Mrs. Chen's voice held that pleading quality everyone used with him now. "Your father asked me to make sure you eat something." Brian picked up the fork, took 3 bites, set it down. The pancakes could have been cardboard for all the pleasure they brought him. Mrs. Chen sighed, the sound heavy with defeat, and left the tray on his nightstand. Through the open door, Brian could hear her whispering to another staff member in the hallway. "Still won't eat? She's holding back for him, do you know that? 3 bites, same as yesterday. Poor little master. Mr. Roberson is going to blame himself again." How could he not? The boy was right there when it happened. Brian's hands tightened around his mother's photograph. The one he slept with, carried everywhere, stared at until his vision blurred. In the picture, Amanda Roberson smiled at the camera, her hair blowing in the wind, eyes bright with joy. It had been taken on the yacht, hours before everything ended. He could still hear the splash, could still see his mother's face disappearing beneath the dark water, could still feel his own frozen terror as he stood on the deck, unable to scream, unable to move, unable to do anything but watch. "Brian?" His father's voice came from the doorway. George Roberson stood there in his business suit, briefcase in hand, looking like a man who'd lost a decade in 18 months. He was handsome still, strong jaw, broad shoulders, the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms. But his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. "I have to go to the office for a few hours," he said, stepping into the room, "but I'll be back for lunch. We could play a game or watch that movie you used to like." Brian stared at him. Through him, really. George's shoulders sagged. "Okay, that's okay. I'll be back soon." He left, and Brian was alone again with his photograph and his silence. The toys surrounding him, remote control cars, building sets, action figures, puzzles, sat untouched, gathering dust. Even the treehouse in the backyard, built specifically to Amanda's design, stood empty and forgotten. At 2 p.m., a car pulled up the circular driveway. Dr. Patricia Meadows, Brian's therapist, the 7th one George had hired, arrived with her leather bag full of assessment tools and hope that was beginning to wear thin. "Hello, Brian," she said brightly, settling into the chair across from him in the study. "How are we feeling today?" Brian looked at her, said nothing. Dr. Meadows tried a new approach, showing him picture cards designed to elicit emotional responses. A happy family, a sad child, an angry dog, a scared cat. Brian stared at each one with the same flat expression. 45 minutes later, Dr. Meadows emerged from the study looking defeated. George waited in the hallway, barely breathing. "Mr. Roberson, She paused, choosing words carefully. "Brian is displaying symptoms of severe childhood depression with possible selective mutism triggered by traumatic grief. His emotional range has completely flattened. He's not processing the loss, he's simply existing. But you can help him." It wasn't a question, it was a desperate plea. "I'm trying, but Brian has built walls that I'm not equipped to scale. I don't know what he needs. Some connection that breaks through where nothing else has worked." After she left, George stood in his home office, surrounded by the evidence of a life that used to make sense. Family photos lined the shelves, Amanda, pregnant and glowing, Brian as a newborn, their first Christmas, beach vacations, birthday parties, a whole timeline of happiness that felt like it belonged to someone else. 18 months, 547 days since I lost my wife and my son stopped being a child, he whispered to the empty room. He picked up the whiskey glass he'd poured an hour ago, still full, and stared into its amber depths. Alcohol couldn't fix this. Money couldn't fix this. Power couldn't fix this. He'd learned that the hard way. George, Monica Prescott's voice came from the doorway. She entered without waiting for permission, perfectly coiffed as always, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I heard the session didn't go well. None of them go well, George set down the glass without drinking. Maybe I should just accept that this is who Brian is now. Don't say that. Monica moved closer, her hand finding his shoulder. The touch lingered a fraction too long, calculated and precise. You're exhausted, overwhelmed, but there are still options. What options? George cracked. We've tried everything. Not everything. Monica perched on the edge of his desk. The charity gala next month, for children's mental health initiatives. It'll be good for your image, George. Show the world you're moving forward. And, who knows, maybe being around other children, seeing you engage with the cause, might trigger something in Brian. George wanted to laugh. His image? He couldn't care less about his image. But the thought of Brian around other people, other children, maybe Monica was right. Maybe exposure to something different, anything different, could create a crack in those walls. Fine, he said quietly. We'll do a gala. Monica's smile was victorious, though her eyes held something else, something George was too tired to examine. Good. I'll handle the planning. You just focus on being ready to shine. Her hand squeezed his shoulder once more before she left, her perfume lingering in the air long after the door closed. The morning of the gala, George found Brian in his room, already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with the photograph in his lap. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but it might as well have been midnight for all the warmth it brought. "Hey, buddy," George said softly. "Big day today. Let's get you dressed up, okay?" He'd laid out Brian's miniature tuxedo, custom-tailored, expensive, perfect. Brian stood when prompted, raised his arms when instructed, allowed himself to be dressed like a mannequin. No protest, no enthusiasm, just mechanical compliance. George knelt to adjust Brian's bow tie, his hands trembling slightly. Your mother would have loved this event. She always cared about helping children, believed everyone deserved a chance to heal. Brian stared past him at nothing. George swallowed hard. "I know you don't understand why we're doing this. Maybe I don't, either. But I need you to know." His voice broke. "I'm trying, Brian. I'm trying so hard to reach you." No response, not even a flicker of recognition. Downstairs, the house had transformed into controlled chaos. Caterers streamed through the kitchen, florists arranged elaborate centerpieces, security personnel checked sightlines and guest lists. The event coordinator barked orders into her headset, managing 100 moving pieces with military precision. And in the middle of it all, mostly unnoticed, Reatha Johnson arrived. She wore the standard uniform of the catering company: black pants, white shirt, black vest. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, her movements efficient and practiced. She carried a box of supplies, napkins, extra silverware, cleaning cloths, and navigated the chaos with the ease of someone who'd worked 1,000 events just like this one. "Reatha, you're setting up the service station by the east windows. And remember, be invisible. These people don't want to see the staff." "Understood," Reatha said quietly. She'd perfected invisibility. It was a survival skill, learned through years of service work, single motherhood, and existing in spaces where people like her were expected to fade into the background. As she worked, setting up glasses and arranging serving trays, she heard two staff members whispering nearby. "Did you see the kid? The son?" "Yeah. Creepy how he just sits there, doesn't talk at all. I heard he hasn't smiled since his mother died. Can you imagine? Rich people problems. They've got everything else." Reatha said nothing, but something twisted in her chest. She knew what it was like to watch a child struggle. Knew what it felt like when love wasn't enough to fix the pain. Her daughter, Jasmine, dealt with her own battles every day. Physical limitations, medical complications, the emotional weight of abandonment. Grief and loss didn't care about your bank account. Through the chaos of preparation, Reatha caught glimpses of Brian. He sat in a corner of the ballroom, already dressed in his tuxedo, clutching a photograph while the world buzzed around him. And something about that image, that small boy so alone despite being surrounded by people, lodged itself in her heart. By evening, the transformation was complete. The Roberson estate glittered like something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors. Thousands of white roses perfumed the air, and a string quartet played soft classical music, and 300 of the city's wealthiest, most influential people began arriving in designer gowns and tailored suits. George stood at the top of the grand staircase, Brian's hand in his. Cameras flashed, guests smiled and waved, the perfect picture of a father and son recovered from tragedy and ready to help others. But George felt his chest tightened with each passing second. He looked down at Brian, at his son's expressionless face, his vacant eyes, his complete disconnection from the celebration happening around him. Somewhere in this glittering crowd of wealth and privilege, George knew there was no solution. He'd invited every specialist, every influential person, every connection he had, and none of them could help. But he'd run out of options, run out of hope, run out of everything except desperation. Tonight, he would make a gamble, a desperate, possibly foolish gamble. And though he didn't know it yet, standing invisible near the service station, arranging napkins with practiced hands, was the woman who would answer a prayer he hadn't known how to pray. The gala began, and with it, everything changed. The Roberson estate had transformed into something beyond opulent. It was a cathedral of wealth, a temple to privilege where every detail whispered of money and power. Crystal champagne fountains sparkled under strategically placed lights, their bubbling cascade providing an elegant backdrop to conversations worth millions. The string quartet played Vivaldi with precision, their music floating through the ballroom like silk. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between guests with silver trays of canapés that cost more per bite than most people's daily meals. Society's elite had turned out in force. Tech moguls rubbed shoulders with old money families, politicians networked with entertainment moguls, supermodels posed for photographers while venture capitalists discussed their latest acquisitions. Everyone wore their wealth casually, as if designer gowns and custom tuxedos were as ordinary as breathing. George Roberson moved through it all like an actor, playing a role he'd perfected but no longer believed in. He shook hands firmly, his smile practiced and appropriate. "Thank you for coming. Your support means everything. Yes, we're doing much better." The words came automatically, hollow performances for an audience that wanted the illusion of his recovery more than the truth of his pain. Monica Prescott remained at his elbow, the perfect business partner playing hostess with calculated grace. She wore a stunning emerald gown that complemented her auburn hair, and she worked the room like a chess master, positioning George beside influential donors and eligible socialites with surgical precision. "George, you remember Victoria Ashford. She's on the board of 3 children's charities." "Of course," George said, extending his hand. "Victoria, thank you for coming. I'm so glad to support the cause, and I've been wanting to tell you how brave you are moving forward after such tragedy." George's smile tightened. Brave? Everyone called him brave, as if survival was a choice rather than a sentence. Monica leaned in, her voice honey-sweet. Victoria's daughter is the same age as Brian. Perhaps they could arrange a playdate sometime. The implication hung in the air, transparent and transactional. George excused himself as politely as possible and moved on. But everywhere he turned, Monica orchestrated similar encounters. Attractive, wealthy, appropriate women positioned perfectly in his path. Across the ballroom, Brian sat at a designated table, a small figure in an expensive tuxedo surrounded by chaos he couldn't connect with. A staff member crouched beside him, trying to engage. "Would you like to see the ice sculpture, young man? It's a swan. Very beautiful." Brian stared at his photograph. The staff member straightened, defeat etched on her face, and walked away. Then came the parade of wealthy women, each attempting their own approach to the sad little Roberson heir. A socialite in diamonds descended on him with an elaborate remote control car. "Look what I brought you, sweetheart. It's the newest model. Costs a fortune, but you're worth it." She placed the toy on the table in front of Brian. He didn't look at it, didn't acknowledge her presence. The woman's smile faltered. "Don't you want to play with it?" Nothing. Not even a glance. She stood, laughing uncomfortably. "Well, maybe later," she said, to no one in particular, and retreated back to the safety of the adult crowd. Another woman appeared, this one younger, carrying designer shopping bags. "I heard you like superheroes," she said, pulling out expensive action figures still in their packaging. "These are limited edition, collector's items." Brian's eyes remained fixed on his mother's photograph. The woman arranged the figures around him like offerings at an altar, but when no response came, she too gave up, muttering something about special children and professional help. Through it all, Reatha Johnson worked in the background, a shadow moving through the glittering crowd. She refilled champagne flutes before they emptied, cleared plates before guests noticed them, wiped water rings from tables before they could stain. Her movements were practiced, efficient, invisible. But she watched, and what she saw made something twist in her stomach. Every interaction with Brian felt transactional, performative. These women weren't trying to reach a hurting child. They were auditioning for a role, playing at compassion while calculating their chances with his father. Their gifts were expensive but empty, their words hollow. They looked at Brian and saw an obstacle, a puzzle to be solved, a gateway to wealth and status. None of them saw what Reatha saw, a little boy drowning in plain sight while everyone around him pretended he was fine. The moment came at 8:47 p.m. George mounted the small stage near the grand staircase, and the music lowered. Conversations hushed. 300 faces turned toward him expectantly, phones at ready to capture whatever carefully crafted message his PR team had prepared. He looked at the speech, then he looked at Brian. His son sat alone at his table, surrounded by abandoned gifts and the ghosts of failed attempts at connection. The champagne fountain sparkled behind him. The quartet played on. The beautiful people continued their beautiful conversations, and Brian existed in a bubble of isolation that all the wealth in the world couldn't penetrate. "We're here tonight to support children's mental health initiatives," George said, "to help families as—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. The irony crashed over him like a wave. Here he stood, hosting a gala for children's mental health, while his own son suffered in ways he couldn't fix. All the money he'd donated, all the programs he'd funded, all the experts he'd hired, and he couldn't help the one child that mattered most. "To help families like mine," George said, abandoning his script. The crowd's energy shifted. This wasn't the speech anyone expected. George's hands gripped the podium until his knuckles went white. 18 months of sleepless nights, of watching his son fade away and feeling utterly powerless despite all his resources, it all came rushing up. "My son hasn't smiled in 18 months. Not since he watched his mother drown." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Guests exchanged shocked glances. This was too honest, too real, too painful for a charity gala where everyone came to feel good about themselves. But George couldn't stop now. The dam had broken. "I've tried everything. The best doctors money can buy, the top therapists in the country, every treatment, every intervention, every program that exists. Nothing works. Nothing reaches him. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Even the quartet had stopped playing. Waiters froze mid-service. Monica stood near the stage, her perfect composure beginning to crack. George looked at Brian again, then back at the crowd. His eyes swept across the sea of wealthy, privileged faces, people who could buy anything, fix anything, control anything, except this. "So tonight," George said, his voice steadying with desperate determination. Monica's head snapped up, sudden alarm crossing her faces. "A desperate promise," George continued, "a maybe foolish one." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. 300 people held their breath. "Whoever makes my son smile, genuinely smile, will be my wife. I'll marry her." The ballroom erupted. Gasps turned to excited laughter. Whispers exploded into excited chatter. Phones emerged from purses and pockets, fingers flying across screens. Within seconds, the declaration was being posted, tweeted, shared across every social media platform. Some guests laughed nervously, assuming it was grief-talking, a wealthy man's breakdown disguised as a grand gesture. Others saw opportunity, their eyes calculating. A few looked genuinely moved by the raw desperation in his voice. But George's face remained deadly serious. His jaw was set, his eyes burning with intensity. "I mean it," he said over the noise. "The woman who can bring back my son's joy deserves everything I have, my name, my fortune, my life, because without Brian's smile, none of it matters." Monica's practiced smile had frozen on her face. This wasn't part of her plan. She'd suggested the gala to improve his image, to position him for the future she'd carefully calculated, with herself as the eventual Mrs. Roberson. Not this. Not a public declaration that opened the door to anyone. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Women were already repositioning themselves, eyeing Brian's table with new interest. George could see the gears turning in their minds, strategies forming, approaches being calculated. He stepped down from the stage and walked through the parting crowd. People reached out to touch his arm, to offer support or congratulations or questions, but he ignored them all. He walked straight to Brian and dropped to his knees beside his chair. "Someone out there can help you, buddy. I know it. Someone can reach you." Brian didn't respond, didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge that anything had happened. His small hands continued clutching the photograph. His eyes remained distant and empty. George's heart cracked a little more. What had he done? Had he just turned his son into a prize to be won? Had desperation finally pushed him too far? Across the ballroom, near the service station by the east windows, Reatha Johnson stood frozen with a champagne bottle in one hand and a glass in the other. The bottle continued pouring even after the glass was full, golden liquid spilling over the rim and splashing onto the silver tray. She'd heard everything. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as rich people's drama, the kind of spectacle the wealthy created when they had too much money and too few real problems. She'd seen it before at these events. Grand gestures, public declarations, moments designed more for cameras than genuine emotion. But when she looked at Brian, really looked at him, all her cynicism evaporated. She saw the same hollow emptiness she'd seen in Jasmine's eyes after her father walked out without a backward glance, the same grief she'd carried through endless nights when medical bills piled up and hope seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. The same frozen quality of a child who'd witnessed something no child should ever see. That wasn't performance. That was survival. That was a little boy who'd learned that showing emotion hurt too much, so he'd stopped feeling altogether. Reatha's hands began to tremble. The champagne bottle slipped slightly in her grip. "Reatha!" her supervisor hissed from nearby. "What are you doing? Get back to work." But Reatha wasn't listening. She set down the bottle and the overflowing glass with careful precision. Her heart hammered against her ribs, Her mind screamed at her to stay in her place, to remain invisible, to not get involved in something so far above her station. But her feet were already moving. She walked through the crowd of designer gowns and custom tuxedos, past the champagne fountains and elaborate floral arrangements, past the society women already circling Brian's table like sharks scenting blood in the water. A few guests frowned at her, confused by the staff member walking with such purpose. One woman actually stepped aside with a look of distaste, as if Reatha's presence in their space was inappropriate. Reatha didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't think about what she was doing or what it might cost her. She just knew, in the deepest part of her soul, that she had to try. Because she recognized that little boy's pain, and maybe, just maybe, recognition was the first step toward healing. Reatha's feet carried her forward, but every step felt like pushing through water. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear it over the ballroom noise, a steady drumbeat of, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" Around Brian's table, a crowd had already formed. The declaration had been made barely 5 minutes ago, and the circling had begun in earnest. A woman in a stunning sapphire gown, Reatha recognized her from magazines, some actress or model, crouched beside Brian with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Hello, darling. Would you like to see a magic trick?" She produced a deck of cards from her clutch, fanning them with practiced flourish. "Pick a card, any card." Brian stared through her as if she were made of glass. The woman's smile strained. She performed the trick anyway, pulling the correct card from behind Brian's ear with a theatrical gasp. "Ta-da! Isn't that amazing?" Nothing. Not even a blink. She stood quickly, her composure cracking, and retreated into the crowd with a forced laugh. "Well, he's certainly a tough audience." Before Brian could process the departure, another woman appeared, this one dripping in diamonds, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. "Sweetheart, I have a grandson your age. Would you like a puppy? We breed champion Labrador retrievers. You could have the pick of the litter." Brian's hands tightened around his photograph. The woman waited, her smile becoming uncomfortable. She straightened with a tight smile and moved away, muttering to her companion about trauma and professional intervention. Then came Monica herself moving in, and George's stomach dropped. She approached Brian with the grace of a practiced performer, kneeling elegantly despite her gown. "Brian, sweetheart, it's Aunt Monica. Remember me? Your father and I worked together. I've known you since you were born." Brian's eyes remained fixed on his photograph. Monica continued, undeterred. "I've brought you something very special. It's a limited edition watch, Swiss-made. Your father has one just like it. You could match." George felt sick. Even Monica, especially Monica. When Brian didn't respond, Monica's perfect smile tightened fractionally. She stood with measured grace. "Perhaps he needs more time," she said to George, her hand finding his arm. "This is all very overwhelming for a child." But George barely heard her. His eyes had caught movement at the edge of the crowd. A woman in a staff uniform, moving through the wealthy guests with determination that seemed out of place. She wasn't dressed for the gala, wasn't adorned with jewels or designer labels. She was nobody, invisible, the kind of person this crowd looked past without seeing. Reatha reached the periphery of the gathering and stopped. Her hands trembled at her sides. The crowd of elegant, educated, wealthy women stood between her and Brian's table. Women with resources, connections, experience. Women who belonged in this world. Who was she to think she could succeed where they'd all failed? "Mama, why doesn't anyone see us?" Jasmine's voice echoed in her memory. They'd been at the grocery store, Reatha pushing the wheelchair through aisles while shoppers walked past without acknowledgement, as if a woman and her disabled daughter were simply part of the fixtures. Jasmine had asked it quietly, not with anger, but with genuine confusion. "Are we invisible?" "No, baby," Reatha had answered, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes. "We're not invisible. Some people just haven't learned how to really see yet." The memory pushed Reatha forward. past the expensive gowns and calculated approaches, past the society women and their elaborate gifts, past Monica's narrowed eyes tracking her movement. She reached Brian's table and, without announcement or fanfare, simply sat down on the floor beside his chair. The marble floor was cold and hard beneath her. At this angle, she was at Brian's eye level, not above him, not performing for him, just beside him, equal. For a moment, Reatha said nothing. She just sat, breathing, her heart still racing but her hands steady now. She could feel eyes on her back, the crowd watching, George watching, Monica watching, but she focused only on the small boy in front of her. Slowly, Reatha reached up to the table and pulled down a cloth napkin. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Baby girl, you don't need fancy things to make magic. Just need love and imagination." Reatha's hands began folding the napkin with practiced precision. Fold, tuck, fold again. The movements were automatic, soothing. She'd done this 1,000 times for Jasmine on difficult nights. "You know," Reatha said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have a little girl at home who feels sad too." Brian's eyes flickered, just a little, just for a second. But it was there, the first crack in the wall. Reatha continued folding, creating a simple puppet. "This is Captain Napkin. He's a very serious fellow who doesn't smile very often." She reached for another napkin, folding it into a different shape. "And this is Princess Wrinkle. She used to laugh all the time, but one day she forgot how. The sound just disappeared." Brian turned his head, slowly, carefully, but definitely. He looked at the napkin puppets. Reatha's breath caught, but she kept going. She made the puppets face each other, using silly voices that came from somewhere deep and genuine. Captain Napkin asked Princess Wrinkle, "Where did your laugh go?" Reatha made the puppet bob and weave. "Did someone steal it?" "No," the princess puppet replied in Reatha's higher voice. "I lost it when the sea monster of sadness came. He was so big and so scary that my laugh just hid." The crowd around them had gone silent. People leaned in, phones raised, capturing every moment. George stood frozen, barely breathing. Monica's face had darkened considerably, her jaw tight. But Reatha saw none of it. She only saw Brian, watching the puppets with the first real focus she'd seen in his eyes. "But I know a secret," Captain Napkin said, leaning close to Princess Wrinkle conspiratorially. "The sea monster can't actually steal laughs. He can only make you forget where you put yours." "Really?" Princess Wrinkle asked, hopefully. "Really. And sometimes," Captain Napkin continued, "sometimes you need help remembering. That's okay. Being sad doesn't mean your laugh is gone forever. It just means it's hiding until you're ready." The puppets began to dance, clumsy and ridiculous. Captain Napkin tripped over his own feet. Princess Wrinkle tried to catch him and fell too. They tumbled in Reatha's hands, a mess of wrinkled napkins and silly voices. Brian's lips twitched. Reatha saw it and continued, making the puppets even more ridiculous. Captain Napkin tried to stand, slipped, and fell again. Princess Wrinkle laughed at him, a high, squeaky laugh that was absurd and perfect. Brian's mouth curved upward, just slightly, just barely. Then Captain Napkin made a terrible joke, the kind that only children find funny, about the sea monster being afraid of tickles. And Brian giggled. It was small at first, just a soft sound that escaped before he could stop it. But then Reatha made Princess Wrinkle attack Captain Napkin with imaginary tickles. And Brian laughed, really laughed, a bright, clear, beautiful sound that cut through the silent ballroom like a bell announcing a miracle. The room erupted. Gasps turned to cheers, cameras flashed in a sudden storm of light. People surged forward, trying to see, to capture, to witness the impossible thing that had just happened. George moved without conscious thought, dropping to his knees beside Reatha and Brian. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked and unashamed. He couldn't speak, couldn't form words, could only stare at his son's smiling face, a face he'd thought might never show joy again. Brian laughed again, watching the napkin puppets continue their ridiculous dance. His whole body shook with it, months of frozen emotion finally breaking free. Reatha's own eyes filled with tears. She kept the puppets moving, kept the story going, even as her vision blurred and her hands trembled. Brian turned to look at her directly for the first time. "Will you tell me more stories?" His voice was small, rusty from disuse, but clear and present and real. Reatha nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "As many as you want, sweetheart. As many as you want." The ballroom exploded with activity. Reporters shouted questions over each other. "Miss, what's your name? How did you do it? Are you accepting Mr. Robertson's proposal?" Guests crowded closer, phones recording from every angle. The story was already going viral. She could hear people dictating posts, capturing video, calling friends. Through the chaos, George met Reatha's eyes. She was still sitting on the floor in her staff uniform, napkin puppets in hand, looking absolutely terrified by this sudden attention. Her shoulders hunched slightly, trying to make herself smaller, invisible again. "George, this is wonderful, but we should get Brian to bed." Monica's voice cut through the noise, sharp and controlled, despite the smile plastered on her face. She pushed through the crowd with practiced ease. "This is all very overwhelming for a child. Too much stimulation." She reached for Brian's arm, but the boy pulled back. His small hand shot out and grasped Reatha's sleeve, holding tight. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice desperate. "Please don't go like Mom did." The words silenced the immediate crowd. Reatha's heart cracked completely open. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," she said gently, covering her hand with hers. "I'm right here." George watched the exchange, something fundamentally shifting in his chest. This wasn't calculation or performance. This was real. This woman, this stranger in a staff uniform, whose name he didn't even know, had done in 5 minutes what 18 months of expensive intervention couldn't accomplish. And Brian was holding on to her like she was life itself. "What's your name?" George asked, his voice rough with emotion. Reatha looked up at him, still kneeling on the marble floor. "Reatha Johnson, sir." "Reatha," George repeated, the name settling into his mind with weight and significance. He glanced at Monica, whose smile had become razor-sharp and dangerous, then at the crowd of guests recording every moment. The billionaire's desperate promise had just become very, very real, and Reatha Johnson, the woman nobody had noticed until 5 minutes ago, had just become the most famous person in the room. The chaos that followed Brian's laugh was like nothing Reatha had ever experienced. The ballroom, already buzzing with energy, erupted into a frenzy of activity that made her head spin. Cameras flashed from every direction. Reporters shouted questions that blurred together into incomprehensible noise. Guests surged forward, trying to get closer, to see, to be part of the moment that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. Reatha remained on the floor, still clutching the napkin puppets, Brian's hand gripping her sleeve. She felt like she was drowning in attention. Every eye in the room suddenly focused on her, the woman who'd been invisible minutes ago, now at the center of a storm she didn't understand and hadn't wanted. "Miss, what's your relationship to Mr. Robertson? How did you know Brian would respond to you? Are you accepting the proposal? What's your name? Where are you from?" The questions came from everywhere and nowhere, voices layering over each other until Reatha couldn't distinguish one from another. Her heart hammered, her breath came short. This was too much, too fast, too everything. Then a firm hand touched her shoulder, not rough, but authoritative. "Excuse me, everyone. Please step back. Give her some space." Reatha looked up to find a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, wearing a headset and an expression that brokered no argument. George's assistant, she would learn later. The woman helped Reatha to her feet while somehow creating a buffer between her and the pressing crowd. "Mr. Robertson would like to speak with you," the assistant said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Privately, if you'll come with me." Reatha nodded mutely, still clutching the wrinkled napkin puppets like they were the only solid things in a tilting world. The assistant led her through the crowd, creating a path with practiced efficiency, until they reached a hallway away from the ballroom's chaos. The heavy door closing behind them muffled the noise to a distant hum. They walked through corridors that Reatha barely registered, expensive art on walls, thick carpet under her feet, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Finally, they reached a room, a study or library, shelves of books lining the walls, leather furniture that probably cost more than a year of her rent. "Wait here, please," the assistant said, then disappeared, leaving Reatha alone. She stood in the middle of the room, still in shock, looking down at the napkin puppets in her hands, Captain Napkin and Princess Wrinkle, wrinkled and crushed now from being clutched so tightly. She almost laughed at the absurdity. These ridiculous pieces of cloth had just changed her life, and she didn't even know how yet. The door opened. George entered first, his tuxedo slightly disheveled now, his hair mussed from running his hands through it. Behind him came Brian, still holding his mother's photograph, but with something different in his expression. Not the blank emptiness from before, but a tentative presence, a boy beginning to emerge from wherever he'd been hiding. George closed the door, muffling the distant ballroom noise further. For a moment, he just looked at Reatha, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't even know your name." "Reatha Johnson, sir. I work for the event company. Just event staff." "Just event staff," George repeated, something like wonder in his voice. He moved to a chair and sat down heavily, as if his legs couldn't hold him anymore. Reatha Johnson, the woman who just did what 18 months of specialists couldn't do? Reatha shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything special, Mr. Robertson. How?" George interrupted, leaning forward. "How did you reach him? What did you see that no one else saw?" Reatha looked at Brian, who'd settled into a leather sofa, still watching her with those newly aware eyes. She thought about all the expensive, elaborate attempts she'd witnessed tonight, the gifts, the performances, the calculated approaches. "I have a daughter," she said finally. "Jasmine. She's 7. She uses a wheelchair, spinal condition since she was a baby. And her father—" Reatha paused, the old pain flickering briefly. "He left when she was 2, decided he couldn't handle a broken child." George's expression softened. "I've watched Jasmine struggle with grief and loss too, different from Brian's, but real, and I learned something. Sometimes people just need someone to sit with them where they are, not try to pull them somewhere else, not try to fix them or change them or make them better. Just meet them in their pain and let them know they're not alone in it." The words settled in the quiet room. George stared at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've been trying to fix him," he said, the realization evident in his voice. "All this time, I've been trying to make him better, to pull him out of his grief, to drag him back to who he was before. But that boy doesn't exist anymore, and maybe he doesn't need fixing. Maybe he just needs someone to sit with him while he figures out who he is now." "Yes," Reatha said simply. George looked at Brian, then back at Reatha. He stood, his posture straightening with decision. "I meant what I said about marriage." Reatha's eyes widened. A nervous laugh escaped her. "Mr. Robertson, you can't be serious. You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." "Then let me," George said, his voice earnest. "Let me get to know you. Let Brian get to know you. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking you to give us a chance, to not disappear back into wherever you came from and let this moment be all we ever have. Reatha started but couldn't finish. This was insane. Billionaires don't marry event staff. This isn't how the world works. Please come back, a small voice said. They both turned to Brian. He'd stood from the sofa, clutching his photograph with one hand, looking at Reatha with an expression that broke her heart. Not blank anymore, not empty, but vulnerable and afraid and desperately hopeful. Please, Brian repeated. I want to hear more stories. Reatha felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, should run from this impossible situation, should protect herself and Jasmine from a world that would never accept them. But she looked at Brian's face and couldn't find the words to refuse. Okay, I will come back, she whispered. Reatha's apartment.
Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor, opened the door before Reatha could get her keys out. Reatha, thank goodness! I've been watching Jasmine, but she's been awake for the last hour. She's very excited. Excited? Reatha stepped inside, confused. Mama! Jasmine's voice came from the living room, high and animated. Mama, you're on the news! Reatha's stomach dropped. She walked into the living room to find Jasmine in her wheelchair, positioned in front of their small TV, her face glowing with excitement. On the screen, shaky phone footage played. Reatha on the floor with Brian, the napkin puppets dancing, the moment of Brian's laugh. The headline beneath read, Mystery Woman Wins Billionaire's Heart. Oh no, Reatha breathed. Mama, is that really you? Jasmine asked, her eyes wide. Did you really make a sad boy smile? Reatha sank onto the worn couch, watching herself on TV. The footage switched to news anchors discussing the story. George Roberson, the tech billionaire, made a shocking promise tonight at his charity gala. Whoever could make his son smile would become his wife. And this woman, identified only as Reatha Johnson, event staff, succeeded where countless others failed. It's like a fairy tale, Jasmine exclaimed, like Cinderella. It's not a fairy tale, baby, Reatha said quietly. It's real life, and real life is complicated. But even as she said it, she watched Brian's face on the screen, the pure joy of his laugh, and felt something shift in her chest. Mrs. Chen made tea while Reatha explained what had happened, editing the story for Jasmine's 7-year-old understanding. The promise, the napkin puppets, Brian's response. She left out the chaos, the pressure, the overwhelming feeling of being suddenly visible in a way that terrified her. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Reatha answered cautiously. Hello? Ms. Johnson, a professional voice, female. This is Catherine Pierce, Mr. Roberson's executive assistant. Mr. Roberson would like to extend an invitation for you and your daughter to have lunch at the Roberson estate tomorrow. Would 1 p.m. work for your schedule? Reatha's instinct was immediately to refuse. This wasn't her world. She didn't belong in mansions and estates. She belonged here, in her small apartment with her daughter, working her jobs, surviving. Mama? Jasmine's voice pulled her attention. Her daughter looked at her with such hope. Are we going to see the boy again? The sad one? Reatha looked at Jasmine, her beautiful, strong, often overlooked daughter who'd faced every challenge with grace Reatha could barely comprehend. Jasmine, who'd watched other children run and play and never complained about her wheelchair. Jasmine, who'd asked repeatedly why her father didn't want her and accepted Reatha's inadequate answers with heartbreaking understanding. Mama, maybe good things can happen to us too, Jasmine said softly. Reatha's throat tightened. Yes, she said into the phone. 1 p.m. works. Thank you. The Roberson estate looked different in daylight, less like a fairy tale and more like an intimidation. Massive, pristine, utterly foreign. The car George had insisted on sending, after Reatha initially refused, pulled up the circular driveway, and Reatha felt her courage wavering. Mama, this is like a castle. Jasmine pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. The driver helped them out, and Reatha carefully maneuvered Jasmine's wheelchair out of the vehicle. The driveway was smooth, perfectly maintained. nothing like the cracked sidewalks they normally navigated. Before they reached the door, it opened. George emerged, still in casual clothes, jeans and a button-down, looking more human than he had in his tuxedo. And then he did something that made Reatha's carefully constructed defenses cracked a little more. He knelt. Not to her, but to Jasmine, getting down to her eye level in the wheelchair, his expression open and genuine. "You must be Jasmine," he said warmly. "I'm George. Your mom helped my son last night. Thank you for sharing her with us." Jasmine's eyes went wide. "You're welcome," she whispered, then gained confidence. "Is Brian here? Can I meet him?" As if summoned, Brian appeared in the doorway. He looked different in daylight too. Younger, more vulnerable in his regular clothes. He held something in his hands, careful and precious. He walked up to Reatha shyly and held it out, a drawing done in crayon, showing two napkin puppets dancing together. "I made this," Brian said quietly, "for you, to remember." Reatha took the drawing with trembling hands. "It's beautiful, Brian. Thank you." "Do you want to play?" Brian asked, then noticed Jasmine. He looked at the wheelchair with curiosity, but no judgment. "Both of you?" "I'd love to," Jasmine said immediately. The afternoon unfolded with surprising ease. George led them to a garden area behind the mansion, beautifully landscaped, but also featuring an accessible playground, ramps, wide paths, equipment designed for children with different abilities. "We had it installed for therapy purposes," George explained, watching Jasmine's face light up. "Brian hasn't used it much, but maybe now." Brian and Jasmine gravitated towards each other immediately. He pushed her wheelchair carefully to different areas of the playground, and she directed him like a captain of a ship. Their laughter, both their laughter, drifted across the garden. George and Reatha found themselves on the terrace, watching the children play, coffee cooling in expensive china cups between them. "She's wonderful," he said, nodding towards Jasmine. "She's my whole world," Reatha replied. Then, because the moment felt honest and raw, she continued. "Her father left when she was 2, said he couldn't handle having a broken child, as if she was broken, as if she wasn't perfect exactly as she is." George's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, It's in the past," Reatha said, though they both knew that kind of pain never fully left. "We've managed. 3 jobs, government assistance, help from neighbors. We survive." "3 jobs?" George asked quietly. Reatha nodded. "Event company, cleaning crew, and weekend shifts at a diner. Jasmine's medical needs are expensive. Insurance doesn't cover everything." The weight of her life sat between them, stark against the backdrop of his mansion and garden and wealth beyond measure. Different worlds, colliding. "Amanda, my wife, died 18 months ago," George said, his voice thick. "Boating accident. Storm came up suddenly. She was swept overboard." Brian saw everything. He paused, staring at his son. "I had all the resources in the world to help him, and none of it worked. Not until you. We're just trying to keep our children afloat."
Reatha said softly. George looked at her, really looked, and Reatha felt seen in a way she rarely experienced. Not as event staff, not as cheap labor, not as someone to overlook, just as another parent fighting the same battle from a different economic reality. "Work for me," George said, suddenly, "as Brian's companion. However many hours you can give. Name your salary. Whatever would let you quit those other jobs and focus on your daughter." Reatha's breath caught. "Mr. Roberson." "George, please." "George," she amended, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "This is moving too fast. Last night I was serving champagne. Today you're offering me a job. Yesterday you didn't know I existed. But I do now," George said, "and Brian needs you. Look at him." They both turned to watch the children. Brian was laughing, actually laughing, as Jasmine told him a story with wild hand gestures. The drawing she'd noted showed the two of them together, and Brian clutched it like treasure. "Just think about it," George said. "No pressure, take a few days, but Brian needs you." He paused.
something vulnerable crossing his face. And maybe I do too. The card George insisted on sending drove them home as the sun began to set. Reatha watched the mansion disappear in the rearview mirror, Jasmine chattering excitedly about Brian and the playground and the fancy lunch they had had. Reatha's phone buzzed, multiple texts coming through now that they were back in range of her normal service. Her sister, "OMG, are you really dating a billionaire?" Her coworker, "Girl, you better tell me everything." An old friend, "Saw you on the news. Be careful. Rich people aren't like us." And then one more, unknown number. Just one line. "Enjoy your moment. It won't last. A friend." Rita's stomach tightened. She stared at the message, ice spreading through her veins. This wasn't friendly. This was a warning. A threat. She didn't know it yet, but Monica Prescott had just made her first move. And in the shadows of privilege and power, the battle for this unconventional family had only just begun. 3 weeks passed in a blur of new routines and unexpected joy. Reatha found herself driving to the Roberson estate each morning, not in a hired car anymore, but in her own beat-up Honda that looked embarrassingly out of place in the circular driveway. She'd accepted George's offer, though she'd negotiated the salary down from his initial, frankly insane, proposal to something that felt less like charity and more like actual employment. The work was unlike anything she'd done before. No cleaning, no serving, no invisible labor. Instead, she spent hours with Brian, reading stories, drawing pictures, having gentle conversations that slowly coaxed more words from him. They did art therapy with finger paints and clay. They built elaborate block towers and knocked them down laughing. They sat in comfortable silence when Brian needed it and filled the air with silly songs when he didn't. Brian's transformation was remarkable. The blank, frozen child from the gala had begun to thaw. He smiled more, not constantly, not without shadows, but genuinely. He spoke in full sentences now, asking questions, expressing feelings, engaging with the world around him. He even started playing with toys again, the expensive action figures and building sets finally coming out of their dust-covered exile. George watched it all from careful distances. He'd appear in doorways, hover in hallways, find excuses to pass by whatever room Reatha and Brian occupied. At first, Reatha thought he was checking on her work, making sure his money was well spent, but gradually she began to recognize something else in his gaze, something that made her stomach flutter in ways she tried hard to ignore. The quiet moments were the most dangerous. Coffee on the terrace while the children played in the garden. Reatha would tell stories about Jasmine's latest adventure at school, and George would share memories of Amanda that no longer felt like knives in his chest. They'd laugh together, tentative at first, then easier, more natural. Laughter returning to the house like a long-lost friend finally coming home. "You know," George said one afternoon, watching Brian teach Jasmine how to build a block castle, "I'd forgotten what this felt like, having someone to share the small moments with." Reatha's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "George." I know. Too fast, too complicated. But I wanted you to know." The staff had begun warming to Reatha, too. Mrs. Chen brought her tea without being asked. Chef Marcus asked her opinion on meals Brian might enjoy. The groundskeeper showed her the garden's best spots for outdoor activities. But not everyone welcomed her presence. "Lucky woman," Reatha overheard one housekeeper whispered to another, "lands a billionaire by making a kid laugh. Wish I'd thought of that. She knows what she's doing, playing the poor single mother card. Clever, really." Reatha pretended not to hear, but the words stung. And then there was Monica. Monica Prescott visited frequently. Too frequently for someone who was just a business partner. She'd appear unannounced, perfectly dressed, offering to help with Brian, suggesting activities, positioning herself as the appropriate choice for George's future. Her eyes would track Reatha's movements with cold calculation, studying, assessing, finding weaknesses. "How domestic," Monica commented once, finding Reatha and Brian making sandwiches in the kitchen. "Playing house." The words were pleasant, but the tone underneath was razor sharp. The article appeared on a Thursday morning. Reatha was at home, getting Jasmine ready for school, when her phone started buzzing with notifications. Text messages, social media alerts, missed calls, all coming in a sudden flood that made her stomach drop. She opened her browser and saw it immediately. The headline screamed from a popular tabloid site: "Gold Digger or Guardian Angel, the truth about Reatha Johnson." Her hands went numb. The article was detailed, thorough, vicious. It painted her entire life as a calculated scheme to trap a wealthy man. Her eviction notices from years ago, when Jasmine's medical bills had overwhelmed her income, were labeled "a history of financial fraud and instability." Her daughter's medical needs became crushing debt that motivated desperate measures. Former coworkers were quoted, their words twisted beyond recognition. "She always talked about wanting to escape poverty. She'd joke about marrying rich," former colleague Janet Martinez said. Reatha had never said anything like that. The closest she had come was once commenting that she wished she could win the lottery to pay for Jasmine's medical bills, a comment made by exhausted mothers everywhere. Photos accompanied the article. Her apartment building, looking even shabbier in professional photography, labeled "the poverty she's desperate to escape." Pictures of her leaving the welfare office, captioned "a woman with nothing to lose and everything to gain." Even a photo of Jasmine's wheelchair ramp at school, with commentary about using her disabled daughter to manipulate a grieving father. The article went viral within hours. Reatha watched in horror as it spread across social media. The comment sections filled with vitriol that made her physically sick. "She's using that child to trap a billionaire. Disgusting. Know your place. He's not going to marry the help. This is why you don't hire those people. They always have an agenda. Poor George Roberson. He's vulnerable right now, and she's taking advantage." The racism was blatant, brutal. The classism, even worse. Hundreds of strangers dissecting her life, her choices, her worth as a human being, all based on lies and twisted truths. "Mama?" Jasmine's voice came from the doorway. "Why are you crying?" Reatha hadn't realized tears were streaming down her face. She quickly closed her laptop, but not before Jasmine caught a glimpse of the screen. "Mama, why are they being so mean? What did you do wrong?" "Nothing, baby," Reatha said, her voice breaking. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Maybe she had been foolish. Maybe she did reach too far above her station. Maybe the world was right and she didn't belong in George's life. She pulled Jasmine close, holding her daughter while her phone continued buzzing with notifications, each one another person weighing in on whether she was worthy of love, of opportunity, of basic human dignity. Her phone rang. George's name appeared on the screen. Reatha answered with trembling hands. "Hello?" "Reatha, don't believe any of it." George's voice was tight with anger. "I'm handling this. My lawyers are already drafting cease and desist letters. We'll sue them for defamation for—" "George, it doesn't matter," Reatha interrupted. "The damage is done. People believe what they want to believe." "I don't believe it." "But everyone else does." Her voice cracked. "They think I'm using Brian. Using you? That I'm some kind of predator? You're not. Brian knows you're not. I know you're not." But Reatha heard the doubt underneath his certainty. Not doubt in her, but doubt in his ability to protect her from this. The helplessness of a man used to controlling everything, suddenly unable to control the narrative, destroying someone he cared about. 2 days earlier, in a sleek downtown office, Monica Prescott sat across from Gerald Hayes, editor of the city's most notorious tabloid. Between them sat a folder stuffed with documents, financial records, employment history, photographs, interviews with carefully selected sources. "This is good work," Gerald said, flipping through the pages. "Thorough. How'd you get access to sealed eviction records?" "I have resources," Monica replied coolly. "The question is whether you'll use it." "It's gold. Rags to riches story, but with a twist. The rags are trying to manipulate the riches. People eat this stuff up." Gerald paused. "But I have to ask, why are you doing this? What's your angle?" Monica's perfectly painted lips curved slightly. "George Roberson is my business partner and friend. I'm protecting him from a mistake." That was the surface truth. But deeper, Monica knew her real motivation. She'd expected George's desperate promise at the gala to lead back to her. She'd been positioning herself for months. The supportive partner, the appropriate choice, the woman who understood his world because she lived in it too. She'd imagined herself as the next Mrs. Roberson, the perfect stepmother to Brian, the completion of the life she'd carefully constructed. Instead, some nobody event staffer with a sad story had swept in and stolen what Monica had been building towards for years. "Give me something that makes her look desperate." "Not lies. I don't need that. Just frame the truth in a way that makes people question her motives." Monica had delivered perfectly. Now, 3 weeks after that meeting, Monica sat in Gerald's office, playing the concerned friend with practiced precision. "George, I hate to say this, but maybe you should reconsider this situation with Reatha, for Brian's sake." Gerald looked up from his laptop, his expression already darkening. "What are you talking about?" "The media attention, the scrutiny. It's only going to get worse. Is this woman really worth putting your son through this? He's finally healing, and now he's going to be subjected to public dissection of his father's love life." "Brian is happier than he's been in 18 months. Reatha made that possible." "But at what cost? Look at what's already happening. The articles, the comments, the judgment. And it will get worse, George, much worse. People will start questioning your judgment, your fitness as a father." "Enough." George stood, his jaw tight with anger. "I know what you're doing, Monica." Monica's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine emotion breaking through the calculated performance. "I'm trying to protect you from making a mistake you'll regret. The only mistake I'm making is listening to this conversation." He moved toward the door, holding it open. "Brian stays with Reatha. That's not negotiable." Monica stood slowly, gathering her composure like armor. "You're making a mistake you'll regret. That woman doesn't belong in your world. She never will." That evening, George did something he'd never done before. He went to Reatha's apartment unannounced. He'd always sent cars, always offered to have her brought to the estate, always maintained that careful distance between their worlds. But tonight, he needed to see her, needed to understand how she really lived, needed to bridge the gap that Monica and the media kept insisting was unbridgeable. The building shocked him, not because it was poor, but because it was so much less than someone like Reatha deserved. The broken elevator, the peeling paint in the hallways, the sounds of neighbors' lives bleeding through thin walls. This was where Reatha came home after spending days in his mansion. This was the reality she returned to. He knocked on apartment 3C. Reatha opened the door, surprise and resignation warring on her face. "George, what are—" "I needed to see you." She stepped aside, letting him into the small space. George took it in with one sweep. The cramped but spotlessly clean living room, Jasmine's medical equipment neatly organized in the corner, worn furniture that had been maintained with obvious care and pride, photos on the walls of Jasmine at various ages, smiling despite everything, a small kitchen table where Reatha sat with the vicious article printed out in front of her. "This is my life," Reatha said quietly, following his gaze. "This is who I really am, not the woman in your mansion. This." George moved to the kitchen table and sat across from her. He picked up the printed article, scanned it briefly, then set it aside. "Maybe they're right," Reatha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I don't belong in your world. Maybe I'm fooling myself thinking I could ever—" George reached across the table and took her hands. "Then I'll leave mine and come to yours." Reatha looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Because wherever you are is where Brian laughs, and where I want to be. Whatever world that is, wherever it exists, that's where I belong." "George, they're going to destroy me," Reatha whispered. "These articles are just the beginning. They'll dig up everything, twist everything, make me into a villain no matter what I do." "Then let them try," George said, his hands tightening around hers. "I'm not losing you. Neither is Brian. We'll fight this together." Outside the window, 3 stories down and across the street, a photographer with a telephoto lens captured the moment. The billionaire and the gold digger in her shabby apartment, hands clasped across the table, faces close together in intimate conversation. The photos would be in tomorrow's tabloids, with headlines screaming about secret meetings and suspicious behavior. Monica would make sure of it. The war had begun. And Reatha Johnson, who'd only ever wanted to help a hurting child smile, found herself in the center of a battle she'd never asked for and didn't know how to fight.
The video appeared on morning news programs without warning, spreading like wildfire across social media before George's PR team could even mobilize. Reatha was in the Roberson kitchen making breakfast when her phone started buzzing incessantly. Texts from numbers she didn't recognize, notifications exploding across her screen. Security footage reveals truth about mystery woman's calculated approach. Her hands froze over the pancake batter. George burst into the kitchen, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand already reaching for the remote. "Don't watch it," he said. But it was too late. The footage was already playing on the mounted television. There was Monica, elegant and poised, kneeling before Brian at the gala. She offered him an elaborate mechanical toy, something expensive and impressive. Brian stared past it, unmoved. The timestamp showed this happened 30 minutes before Reatha's interaction. But then the video cut, a jarring edit that anyone paying attention would notice, and suddenly showed Reatha in the background, watching Monica's failed attempt. Another cut, and there was Reatha approaching with her napkin puppets. The implication was surgical. She'd studied what didn't work and calculated her approach. "This changes everything," the morning show host declared with practiced gravity. Was the napkin puppet show genuine connection, or was it a con? Did this woman manipulate a child for her own gain? A panel of experts dissected her every movement like forensic investigators. A child psychologist with impressive credentials suggested Brian's smile might have been a stress response, not genuine joy. A body language expert pointed out how Reatha positioned herself at Brian's eye level. Classic manipulation technique, the expert claimed. George threw the remote across the room. "It's edited. Anyone can see it's been cut to pieces." But Reatha knew the truth didn't matter. Not anymore. The narrative was already written, already becoming truth through repetition. "Mama?" Jasmine's voice came from the doorway, her wheelchair bumping slightly against the frame. "Why are they saying mean things about you?" Before Reatha could answer, Brian appeared behind Jasmine, his small face pale. He'd seen it too. The house staff had been watching on the television in the staff quarters, and he'd wandered in during their morning routines. Ryan walked slowly into the kitchen, his eyes fixed on Reatha with an expression that broke her heart. Not anger, but confusion. The kind of confusion that children feel when their world stops making sense. "Did you watch Monica first? Did you study what to do?"
"Brian," George started, but Reatha held her hand. She knelt before the boy, the same way she had that first night, meeting him at his level. "No, sweetheart, I would never do that. I saw you, and you reminded me of Jasmine when she's sad. I just wanted to help." "But the TV said—" "The TV is lying," George interjected firmly. "Someone edited that video to make it look like something it wasn't." Brian's small hands clutched the hem of his shirt, a nervous gesture Reatha had helped him overcome weeks ago. Now it was back. "How do I know what's real?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Because doubt, once planted, grew like weeds. By evening, Reatha's other job had become unbearable. She arrived at the office building for her night shift with the cleaning crew, and the atmosphere shifted the moment she entered. Her coworkers, women she'd worked alongside for 3 years, watched her with expressions ranging from envy to contempt. "Must be nice," Maria muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Landing a billionaire while the rest of us actually work for a living." "I am working," Reatha said quietly, reaching for her cleaning cart. "For now, until you get that ring and never have to clean another toilet." Reatha kept her head down, pushing her cart towards the elevators. She cleaned these floors 1,000 times, knew every corner, every stubborn stain. This had been honest work she'd been proud of. Now it felt poisoned. Her supervisor, Mr. Patterson, intercepted her before she reached the 5th floor. His expression was uncomfortable, apologetic, but firm. "Reatha, we need to talk." Her stomach dropped. She already knew. "The company's been getting complaints. Clients don't want you on their floors. They say you're famous now, but for the wrong reasons. They're worried about media attention, photographers showing up, that sort of thing." "I've never brought any of that here," Reatha protested. "I've always been professional." I know you have, but perception matters in this business." He handed her an envelope. 2 weeks severance. "I'm sorry, Reatha. I really am." She took the envelope with numb fingers, nodded mechanically, and left before anyone could see her cry. At home, Jasmine was already crying. Mrs. Chen had called ahead, warning Reatha that something had happened at school. When Reatha wheeled through the apartment door, she found her daughter curled on the couch, her small body shaking with sobs. "Baby, what happened?" Through tears, Jasmine told her. The kids at school had seen the news coverage. They'd formed a circle around her wheelchair during recess, chanting, "Your mama's a gold digger, your mama's a gold digger." The teachers had intervened, but not before Jasmine heard every word. Worse, she'd caught the uncomfortable looks from the teachers themselves, the ones who wondered if maybe the kids weren't entirely wrong. "I want things to go back to normal," Jasmine sobbed against Reatha's shoulder. "I want my regular mama back. I want people to stop looking at us like we're bad." Reatha held her daughter, rocking her gently, and felt something inside herself crack completely. Her pursuit of happiness, if that's even what this was destroying the person she loved most. What kind of mother was she? What kind of person? "What am I doing? I'm destroying my child's peace for a fantasy." That night, after Jasmine finally fell asleep, Reatha sat at their small kitchen table and made the hardest decision of her life. Her phone sat in front of her, George's last text message still on the screen. "Ignore everything. We'll get through this together." But they wouldn't. She saw that now. The world George lived in would never accept her, and fighting that world meant subjecting her daughter to cruelty Jasmine didn't deserve. With trembling fingers, Reatha typed, "I can't do this anymore. Brian deserves better. You both do." She hit send before she could reconsider, then immediately blocked his number. If she heard his voice, she'd lose her resolve. She packed quickly, just one small bag for her and Jasmine. Her aunt lived 3 hours away, in a city where nobody knew about billionaires or charity galas or napkin puppets. They could disappear there, at least for a while. "Jasmine, baby, wake up." Reatha gently shook her daughter. "We're going to Aunt Marie's for a visit." Right now? Just for a while. Just until things calm down. George read the message and felt panic flood his system. He tried calling. Blocked. He tried texting. The messages turned green, undelivered. He drove to her apartment, breaking every speed limit. When he pounded on her door, only Mrs. Chen appeared from the neighboring unit. She left about an hour ago, the elderly woman said, sympathy evident in her eyes. Had a bag packed, looked heartbroken. That poor girl. Did she say where she was going? Mrs. Chen shook her head. Just said she needed to protect her daughter. George returned home in a daze. The mansion felt cavernous and cold, every room a reminder of the warmth Reatha had brought. He found Brian in his bedroom, sitting on his bed, unnaturally still. In his hands was the small stuffed dog Reatha had given him during their second week together, a goofy-looking thing from a thrift store that Brian had named Captain Fluff. "She's not coming back, is she, Dad?" Brian asked, without looking up. George sat beside his son, and for once he didn't have an answer. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have hope. "I don't know, buddy." 5 days crawled like years. Brian stopped eating properly, pushing food around his plate without interest. He stopped talking as much, his sentences becoming shorter, his laughter, that precious sound they'd fought so hard to restore, fading like a dying echo. The light Reatha had brought began to dim, and George watched helplessly as his son slipped backward into that familiar darkness. George searched frantically. He hired private investigators, traced phone records, called in every favor he had, but Reatha had truly vanished, leaving no digital footprint, no trail to follow. She'd lived her whole life being invisible to people like him. She knew how to disappear. On the 6th morning, George found Brian in Amanda's old room, a space they'd kept locked since her death. Brian sat by the window, Captain Fluff in his lap, staring out at the garden where he and Reatha had played. "Dad," Brian said quietly, "when Mom left, she didn't mean to. The ocean took her. But Reatha chose to leave us." The words hit George like physical blows. His son was right. Amanda's death had been tragedy, beyond anyone's control. But Reatha's departure was choice, her choice to protect herself and Jasmine from a world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. And suddenly, George realized something that terrified him. He wasn't just searching for Brian's smile anymore. He was searching for the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd shown him that love wasn't about grand gestures or unlimited resources, but about showing up, sitting on the floor, and making napkin puppets while the world watched. But finding her meant confronting the person who'd driven her away, the person who'd orchestrated this entire nightmare. It was time to deal with Monica.
Marcus Chen, George's head of security for the past decade, had seen many things in his career: corporate espionage, blackmail attempts, stalkers. But nothing had prepared him for what he'd uncovered in the past 72 hours. He entered George's study without knocking, a breach of protocol that spoke volumes. George looked up from his desk where he'd been staring at his phone, willing it to ring with news about Reatha. "I've found something," Marcus said, setting his laptop on the desk. "You're not going to like it." The unedited security footage played first, not the manipulated version that had destroyed Reatha's reputation, but the complete recording from the gala's multiple camera angles. It showed everything. Monica approaching Brian 3 separate times over the course of the evening, each attempt more elaborate than the last. An expensive remote-controlled car, a tablet loaded with games, a promise to take him to Disneyland. Brian had barely glanced at any of it. Then came the audio, crystal clear from the ballroom's sound system that had been recording for the event. Monica's voice, caught in conversation with Eleanor Rothschild near the bar. "Watch me land this. The boy's the key to everything. George won't be able to resist a woman who succeeds where everyone else failed." Eleanor's response, "But what if someone else?" "They won't. I've studied child psychology, hired the best experts. I know exactly what that boy needs.
George's hands clenched into fists as the recording continued. Marcus pulled up another window. Financial records. Monica made 3 payments totaling $200,000 to a private investigator named Derek Simmons. His specialty? Digging up dirt on people who can't afford lawyers to fight back. The trail was meticulous. Wire transfers to tabloid editors, email chains coordinating the release of damaging stories, text messages with the videographer who'd edited the security footage, explicit instructions on which sections to cut, which to emphasize. The most damning evidence came last, an email Monica had sent to a media consultant. The narrative is simple. Desperate single mother latches onto billionaire's tragedy. We need to make her look calculated, opportunistic. Find anything that shows financial struggle, frame it as motivation. The public eats the stuff up. Once she's gone, George will need someone stable, someone from his world. That's when I make my move. George read it 3 times, each pass making his blood run colder. Monica Prescott, his business partner for 5 years, someone he'd trusted with company secrets, with business decisions worth millions, someone he'd let into his home, around his son. She'd been playing a game, and Brian had been the prize. "Call an emergency board meeting," George said, his voice deadly calm. "Every executive, every major shareholder, I want them there in 2 hours." Marcus nodded. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done the moment she started undermining Reatha." George stood, straightening his tie. "I'm going to remove the cancer from this company." The Roberson Technologies boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the downtown headquarters, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a table of polished mahogany that could seat 30. Today, every seat was filled. Executives in tailored suits, shareholders who'd flown in on short notice, the company's legal team positioned strategically around the room. Monica arrived last, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, her heels clicking confidently across the marble floor. She smiled at familiar faces, squeezed shoulders, played the role she'd perfected over the years. Indispensable partner, trusted advisor, the woman who kept things running smoothly. She took her usual seat to George's right, crossing her legs and opening her tablet like this was just another quarterly review. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," George began, his voice neutral. He stood at the head of the table, a manila folder and laptop positioned before him. "We're here to discuss trust, the foundation of any partnership, any business relationship." Several board members nodded. Monica's smile remained steady, though something flickered behind her eyes. "Trust is what allows us to make decisions together, to share responsibilities, to build something greater than ourselves." He opened the laptop, angled it so the screen faced the room. "Trust is also what makes betrayal so devastating." He pressed play. The unedited security footage filled the screen mounted on the wall. Monica's 3 attempts with Brian played in chronological order, time-stamped and clear. Then came the audio recording, her voice filling the ballroom. "Watch me land this. The boy's the key to everything." Monica's face drained of color. Around the table, executives shifted uncomfortably. The shareholders' expressions hardened. "George, I can explain," Monica started. "Protecting me? Is that what you were doing?" George cut her off, his voice like ice. He pulled up the financial records next, displaying them on the screen. $200,000 in payments to a private investigator, wire transfers to tabloid editors, email chains with explicit instructions to destroy an innocent woman's reputation. Monica stood abruptly. "George, you don't understand. I was protecting you from making a terrible mistake. That woman," George said, his voice rising for the first time, "showed my son genuine kindness, something you were incapable of." He pulled up the email, the one about controlling George through his son. Several board members gasped audibly. "You didn't care about Brian," George said, each word deliberate. "You saw an opportunity, a vulnerable child as a means to an end." Monica's facade finally cracked, her perfectly composed expression twisted into something ugly. "And what is she, George? A cleaning woman with nothing to offer, no education, no connections, no understanding of our world."
She offered my son his childhood back, George replied quietly. The contrast between his calm and her hysteria made her outburst even more damning. The room was absolutely silent. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud.
George addressed the board directly. Monica Prescott has violated company ethics, engaged in illegal harassment, and abused her position for personal gain. I'm calling for an immediate vote on her removal from Roberson Technologies. All partnership agreements will be dissolved, stock options revoked, and legal action pursued for damages. The vote was swift, unanimous. Hands raised around the table without hesitation. Monica's allies, the few she'd cultivated, remained silent, unwilling to go down with her. Monica stood rigid, her dignity shredding in real time. You're choosing poverty over partnership, George. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment. You'll regret this. George met her eyes, unflinching. The only regret I have is not seeing you clearly sooner. Security will escort you out. As two security guards appeared at the door, Monica grabbed her purse with shaking hands. She paused at the threshold, her voice venomous. She'll never fit into your world, George. This will destroy you both. Then let it, George said simply. Destroy me, I mean. Because a world where someone like you thrives isn't one I want to live in anyway. Monica left without another word. With Monica dealt with, George refocused all his energy on finding Reatha. Marcus's team had been working around the clock, and finally, on the 7th day after her disappearance, they caught a break. Found her, Marcus said over the phone. Small city called Riverside, about 3 hours north. She's staying with an aunt working night shifts at a distribution warehouse. George was already grabbing his keys. Send me the address. He collected Brian from his room, where he had been lying listlessly on his bed, Captain Fluff clutched to his chest. Get dressed, buddy. We're going to get Reatha. Brian's eyes widened. Really? You found her? I'll always find her, George said, helping his son into a jacket. They drove through the night, Brian eventually falling asleep in the back seat. George's mind raced with everything he wanted to say, needed to say. How he'd failed to protect her. How he'd been blind to Monica's manipulation. How he couldn't imagine his life, Brian's life, without her in it. The warehouse appeared just after 2 a.m., a squat concrete building in an industrial park. Through the dirt-streaked windows, George could see workers moving between towering shelves, forklifts beeping in the background. And there she was. Reatha, in a safety vest and work gloves, stacking boxes onto a pallet. Even from this distance, George could see the exhaustion in her movements, the weight she carried in her shoulders. She looks sad, Dad, Brian whispered from the back seat, now awake. George's chest tightened. Yeah, buddy, she does. He parked and walked to the office entrance, Brian's hand in his. The night supervisor looked up, surprised. Help you? I need to speak with Reatha Johnson, please. It's urgent. The supervisor hesitated, then picked up a radio. Johnson, to the office. A few minutes later, Reatha appeared in the doorway, still wearing her work gloves. She froze when she saw them, her face cycling through shock, fear, and something that might have been hope, before she locked it down. How did you find me? George took a step forward. I'll always find you. In the warehouse parking lot, under harsh, fluorescent lights that turned everything sickly yellow, the three of them stood in awkward silence. A truck rumbled past on the nearby highway. The night air was cold, carrying the smell of diesel and concrete. Reatha wouldn't meet George's eyes. She stood rigid, her arms wrapped around herself defensively. But when Brian moved toward her, she crumbled. She dropped to her knees, bringing herself to his level the way she always did. I'm sorry I left, she whispered, her voice
breaking. "I'm so sorry." Brian's response shattered her. He left because people were mean, like when kids were mean to Jasmine. He understood. This brave, damaged, healing little boy understood everything. "But Dad made the mean lady go away, and we need you to come home." Reatha looked up at George finally, questions flooding her eyes. "What mean lady? What happened?" George pulled out his phone, showing her the evidence Marcus had compiled. The unedited footage, the financial records, Monica's emails. He watched as Reatha's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to fury. "It's over," George said quietly. "Monica's gone. She's been removed from the company, and we're pursuing legal action. And I'm about to make sure the whole world knows the truth." "George," Reatha started to protest, "I'm calling a press conference tomorrow. Will you come?" He knelt beside her, beside Brian, the three of them on the cold asphalt. "Not for me. For Brian. Let people see the truth. Let them see who you really are." Reatha looked at Brian's hopeful face, then back at George, the man who'd driven 3 hours in the middle of the night, the man who dismantled his own company partnership to defend her, the man who was offering her something she'd never had: a voice. After a long moment, she nodded, but her voice was firm when she spoke. "I have one condition." "Anything," George said. "I need to do this my way."
The grand hall of the Roberson estate had never held this many people. Camera crews positioned themselves along the walls, their equipment creating a maze of cables and lighting stands. Reporters packed the folding chairs, arranged in neat rows, notebooks open, recorders ready. Beyond the windows, news vans lined the circular driveway. Satellite dishes pointed skyward. The speculation had been building since George's office sent out the press release 12 hours ago. George Roberson to address recent events, live statement at 2 p.m. Is he ending the relationship? A reporter from a national network whispered to her cameraman. Maybe he's doubling down, another suggested. Rich guy defends his choice, tries to rehabilitate her image. Or maybe he's announcing she's been arrested for fraud, someone else offered cynically. The murmuring stopped when George walked onto the small stage at the front of the hall. He wore a simple dark suit, no tie, the most casual anyone had seen him at a public event. Brian walked beside him, their hands clasped together. The boy's other hand clutched Captain Fluff, the stuffed dog he'd barely put down since Reatha's return. George approached the podium, and Brian stood close, his small body pressed against his father's side. "Thank you for coming," his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. 18 months ago, I lost my wife. Amanda drowned in a boating accident while my son watched. 6 days ago, I almost lost my son again. Not to death, but to the cruelty of people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. The room went completely silent. This wasn't the corporate George Roberson they knew, the one who spoke in careful PR statements. This was a father, raw and unfiltered. Many of you have reported on Reatha Johnson over the past few weeks. You've questioned her motives, her character, her worthiness. You've published edited footage designed to make her look calculating. You've dug through her past and weaponized her struggles. George pressed a button on the laptop before him. The large screen behind him lit up with the unedited security footage from the gala. This is what actually happened that night. The room watched as Monica approached Brian 3 separate times, each attempt failing. Then Reatha appeared, sitting on the floor with her napkin puppets. No calculation, no studied approach, just genuine connection. The timestamp proved the interactions were hours apart, not the minutes the edited version had implied. Then came the audio. Monica's voice filled the hall. "Watch me land this. The boy's the key to everything." Reporters began scribbling furiously. Cameras flashed. The energy in the room shifted.
George pulled up financial records next, displaying them for all to see. Monica Prescott, my former business partner, paid $200,000 to destroy Reatha Johnson's reputation. She hired investigators, paid tabloid editors, and orchestrated a smear campaign against a woman whose only crime was showing kindness to my son. He clicked through emails, text messages, all of it meticulously documented. I have letters here from Brian's therapists. Every single one testifies to his remarkable progress since meeting Reatha. His pediatric psychologist wrote, "Brian's transformation has been extraordinary. Miss Johnson has provided the genuine emotional connection that 18 months of professional intervention could not achieve." George's voice strengthened. "This woman has been attacked for showing my son genuine kindness. She's been called a gold digger, a con artist, opportunistic. She's lost her job, her privacy, her peace. And why? Because she had the audacity to care about a hurting child while being poor." The room buzzed with energy, reporters exchanging glances, phones emerging to fact-check. The story they'd come for completely transformed. Then George stepped back from the microphone. "But I'm not here to defend Reatha Johnson," he said clearly. "She's here to speak for herself." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras swiveled toward the side entrance. Reatha emerged, and the flashing intensified. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing designer, nothing borrowed from George's world. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore no jewelry except for a small silver cross her grandmother had given her years ago. She looked exactly like what she was, a working mother who had been thrust into circumstances beyond her control. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the microphone, but her steps were steady. "I didn't plan any of this," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Reatha Johnson. I'm a single mother. I worked multiple jobs to support my daughter Jasmine, who has medical needs that insurance barely covers. I was working the charity gala as part of an event staff, just trying to make rent." She paused, gathering herself. "I saw a sad little boy who reminded me of my daughter on her hardest days. When her father left us and she asked me why he didn't love her enough to stay. When kids at school mocked her wheelchair and she came home crying. I know what it looks like when a child is drowning in grief." Her voice grew stronger. "I didn't see a billionaire son that night. I saw a child hurting. And I did what any mother would do. I tried to help." Reatha looked directly at the cameras now, at the millions who would watch this. "Yes, I've been evicted. Yes, medical bills are crushing. Yes, I work as cleaning staff. I worked as cleaning staff," she corrected, a hint of bitterness entering her tone. "I'm not ashamed of honest work. My mother cleaned houses. My grandmother cleaned houses. They taught me dignity doesn't come from your job title. It comes from how you treat people."
Her hands gripped the podium. "But I never asked George for anything. I never wanted his money. I didn't see dollar signs when I looked at Brian. I saw a child who needed someone to sit with him in his pain." Her voice cracked. "I just wanted to help a child smile again. That's all. And for that, I've been called every name you can imagine." She addressed it head-on, unflinching. "Some people think I don't deserve to be here, that I don't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. Maybe they're right. This isn't my world. I don't know which fork to use at fancy dinners. I shop at thrift stores. My idea of a vacation is a day at the public pool." Reatha's eyes found George's across the stage. "But Brian's smile, that's real. His laughter is real. The way he talks about his feelings now instead of hiding them, that's real. And if loving that child and his father makes me a gold digger, then I'm guilty." The room was absolutely silent. Several reporters had stopped taking notes, simply listening. "I don't need a billionaire," Reatha said, her gaze still locked on George. "I need a man who sees me. Not my bank account, not my social status, not what I can do for his image. Just me, Reatha. The woman who makes napkin puppets and tells silly stories and knows what it's like to choose between medication and groceries."
Before anyone could respond, the side door opened again. Jasmine wheeled herself onto the stage, her small face serious and determined. Mrs. Chen walked beside her, one hand on the wheelchair's handle for support. Jasmine rolled right up to the microphone. Reatha started to kneel beside her, but Jasmine shook her head. She wanted to be heard. A reporter adjusted the microphone downward so the 8-year-old could reach it. My mama taught me that love isn't about money. It's about showing up. When I was in the hospital and the doctor said I might not walk again, Mama showed up every day. When kids were mean at school, she showed up. When we had no money and she was scared, she still showed up for me. Jasmine looked at Brian, who'd moved to stand beside her. And she showed up for Brian too. Not because his dad is rich, because he was sad and she knew how to help. Brian reached out and took Jasmine's hand. The image, two children from completely different worlds standing together in solidarity, was captured by every camera in the room. It would be viral within the hour. After the press conference, away from the cameras and questions and flashing lights, the four of them gathered in George's private study. The door was closed, the world locked out. Brian and Jasmine sat together on the leather couch, Captain Fluff between them, comparing stories about their mothers. Reatha stood by the window, looking out at the manicured gardens, still processing everything that had happened. George approached quietly, standing beside her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for fighting for me. I should have fought sooner. I should have seen what Monica was doing. You were grieving. You can't blame yourself for trusting someone." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the children's laughter behind them. George turned to face her fully. "Reatha, I made a promise at that gala that whoever made my son smile would be my wife." Reatha's breath caught. "But that's not why I'm asking you to stay." He took her hands in his, thumbs brushing across her knuckles. "You've shown me that family isn't about bloodlines or matching worlds or having the same bank account. It's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love even when it's hard, even when the world tells you it's wrong." Reatha's tears began to flow, silent and unchecked. "Are you proposing, George Roberson?" she whispered. He smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in days. "I'm asking, will you build a family with us? Not because of a promise I made in desperation, but because we choose each other, because I can't imagine my life without you in it." Reatha looked past him to where Brian and Jasmine sat, already siblings in everything but name. She thought about the journey that had brought them all here, grief and loss and unexpected connection. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." George pulled her close, and Reatha let herself be held. Behind them, Brian and Jasmine cheered. They were a family now, not perfect, not conventional, but real. And that was enough.
The beach stretched endlessly in both directions, golden sand meeting blue water under a cloudless sky. George stood at the edge of the parking lot, his feet still on concrete, staring at the shoreline that had haunted his nightmares for 18 months. "We don't have to do this," Reatha said, beside him, her hand in his. "Yes, we do," George replied quietly. "We can't keep running from it." They'd gotten married quietly 3 months ago, a small ceremony in the garden with just family and close friends. No media circus, no elaborate spectacle. Just vows spoken under a simple arch, with Brian as ring bearer and Jasmine as flower girl. both children beaming with joy. Now they were here, at the place where Amanda had died, the place George had sworn he'd never return to. But healing required facing the pain. Brian and Jasmine were already ahead of them, racing toward the water's edge. Well, Brian was racing. Jasmine's wheelchair rolled steadily beside him, powered by her strong arms. George had purchased a specialized beach wheelchair that could handle sand, and Jasmine had declared it the coolest thing ever. "Look at them," Reatha said, wonder in her voice. "6 months ago, I didn't know if Jasmine would ever laugh again, if Brian would ever be a real kid." They watched as Brian helped Jasmine position her wheelchair at the water's edge, both children shrieking with delight when a wave crashed closer than expected, splashing their feet. "I thought I'd never come back here," George admitted, finally stepping from concrete onto sand. Reatha squeezed his hand. "Sometimes you have to face the pain to find the healing." They walked slowly toward the children, George's steps heavy at first, then lighter. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility. "Dad, Reatha, come here," Brian called out, waving frantically. They joined the children at the water's edge. Small waves lapped at their feet. Seabirds circled overhead. It was a perfect day, the kind of day Amanda had loved. Brian looked up at George, his eyes bright and clear, so different from the blank stare of 18 months ago. "Dad, I want to tell you something." "What is it, buddy?" "I think Mom would like Reatha and Jasmine. I think she'd want us to be happy." George's throat tightened. He couldn't speak for a moment, emotion overwhelming him. Reatha knelt beside Brian in the wet sand, bringing herself to his level the way she always did. "Your mom loved you so much," she said gently, "and she always will. Nothing changes that." "I know," Brian said seriously, "but there's room for more love, right?" "Always," Reatha confirmed, pulling him into a hug. Brian smiled, that beautiful, genuine smile that had started everything, and pulled away from Reatha's embrace. He turned to face the ocean, took a deep breath, and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Mom," he shouted to the waves, "I'm okay now. We're going to be okay." The words carried across the water, a message of healing and release, a goodbye that was also a promise. George pulled Reatha to her feet and wrapped his arm around her waist. Jasmine reached for George's other hand. Brian took Reatha's free hand. They stood in a circle, 4 people from different worlds who'd become a family not through promises made in desperation, but through the choice to love when it would have been easier to walk away. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The same ocean that had taken Amanda now stretched before them peacefully, waves rolling in endless rhythm. "I used to think this place only held pain." "And now?" Reatha asked. "Now it holds possibility." He looked at his son, at his new wife, at the daughter he'd gained. "Amanda will always be part of us, but we're building something new, something beautiful." Brian released their hands and waded a few steps into the shallow water, Jasmine's wheelchair positioned just at the edge. He bent down, cupping water in his small hands, then let it pour back into the ocean. "What are you doing, buddy?" George called out. "Giving something back," Brian replied. "The ocean took Mom, but it gave me Reatha and Jasmine, so I'm saying thank you." Reatha's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of joy and healing, not grief. As the sun touched the horizon, they stood together at the water's edge, not because the hurt had disappeared, but because they'd chosen to face it together. 4 people who'd been broken in different ways. 4 people who'd found wholeness in each other. A family built not on promises made in desperation, but on the quiet, daily choice to show up,
to stay, to love, even when the world said it was impossible. Brian's smile had brought them together, but it was love, messy, complicated, real love, that would keep them whole. The waves continued their eternal dance with the shore, and somewhere in that rhythm, they found their peace.
Thank you for spending your time with us, family. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reason to smile again. And if you're new here, welcome to the Eva family. We tell stories that heal, inspire, and remind us all that even in darkness, light still finds its way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep smiling.